Busting Indie Myths Part 21. And we are busting indie myths on the daily, weekly, monthly and yearly until the Scot Nats see clearly that we're down with the capital U to the K to the A to the double F G. And in this Busting Indie Myths Part 21, we're going to address the recently heard notion that the United Kingdom is somehow based only on consent of its parts and not on law. The implication being here that if one part does not consent to being part of the union any longer, then it's game over for the entire union. And this is a relatively recent Scottish nationalist innovation, and we've only been hearing it in the last few weeks, actually. And I'm not going to name the names of the people who are pushing this around, but there's some quite well-connected people who are thinking this is the next big argument that the SNP are going to win on. Well, they can't win on it because they're entirely wrong, as usual, on things. You know, so and it was brought to my attention when a BBC presenter interviewed Keir Starmer at the weekend there on the Sunday show, and it was a little bit of a cheeky interview, I have to say. And I have to say the BBC presenter was really he seemed to have an agenda in some of the ways that he was saying things, but one of the sort of questions that he asked was something to the extent that, is Scotland in a voluntary union? And Keir Starmer said, well, yes, of course. But you see, what was meant there, again, it's sneaky. It's if you're saying, is Scotland in a voluntary union, and you agree to that without clarifying what you mean, then they'll say, well then, if you should consent to another referendum then. They'll demand that we agree to another referendum based only on the principle of consent and not on the principle of law as well. And that's the way that they play, and we'll be hearing a lot more of this when the Supreme Court judgment comes out. And why do they do this? Well, firstly, it is rubbish. The British Union has been based on laws as well as consent since the very start of it in 1707, and every day laws help the British Union to continue to operate. So the British Union is certainly based on laws as well as consent, and the two should not be thought to exist only on their own. Because the UK is a unitary state, which is a state governed as a single entity in which the central government is the supreme authority. And laws are critical to the operation of such a unitary state. But they do this because they want us to believe that the United Kingdom Parliament, the Parliament that is running the unitary state, the nationalists want us to believe that that Parliament should have no say in the destruction of that unitary state, and that everybody else in the United Kingdom should just stand watching helplessly as the union crumbles around them because there's no law holding it together. That's what they want us to believe. They're trying to get rid of the idea that the union can be held together by law as well as consent. So what's the pro-UK frame then? The nationalist frame is that the union is only held together by consent. The pro-UK frame is that it is held together by consent and also by law. And it is held together by law because everybody else in the United Kingdom is involved in this, and they need to have a way of having their say. And they have their say through the British Parliament, which is the Parliament that is responsible for keeping the United Kingdom together. Democratically speaking, all the parts of the United Kingdom should be involved and considered and indeed protected where necessary. And we, as unionists, consider those elements Everybody has to be involved. It's the British Parliament, the Union Parliament, which is responsible for involving everybody in such a massive event as the potential destruction of the unitary state and the nation itself. Because, as I say, we're more than just a voluntary union based on consent. We're also a legal union based on laws. We're bound both by consent and by law. And that's the way that it should be. That's how a nation operates. A nation operates on law. There's nothing controversial about that. The laws are there to ensure that we're all involved and we're all considered, and if necessary, we're protected from the actions of any one of the parts that decides to go off and do its own thing. And this is why we're not like the EU. The United Kingdom is not like the EU, okay? The EU is simply a voluntary union where one of its members can, if it wants, go off and decide to do its own thing, as in fact Britain did. There is no overarching laws or parliament in the EU which can forbid and prevent a member nation leaving. But there is in the United Kingdom, because we are one nation, and so we have to have laws to keep that one nation together. So, in conclusion, we can say that Scotland is part of the United Kingdom, which is a unitary state, with the British Parliament at its centre. The UK is more than a voluntary union based on consent. It is also a legal union based on law. We are bound both by consent of the parts and by the law at the centre. And we must be bound by law because all of us must be involved and considered and protected where necessary in any constitutional matter. And thank goodness that's the case, because pro-UK folk, throughout the United Kingdom, we want to know that we're held together by something more substantial than the momentary whim of a minority of the Scottish electorate at a one-off referendum on one day, which could be won by a tiny margin, which would represent a minuscule proportion of the overall UK electorate. Okay, we all want to know that we're protected from that. We all want to know that the United Kingdom is holding together by something more substantial than that. So here endeth Busting Indy Myths Part 21.